The space station Calypso was not a beautiful place. It was old and loud, full of hissing pipes and flickering lights, but it was neutral ground. That was the only thing that mattered. Representatives from 12 different civilizations had come here to talk, and talking was better than fighting, even if just barely. Colonel Ethan Cole stood near the far wall of the main hall and watched the room fill up. He was not tall. He was not built like a fighter. He had an average face, short brown hair going a little gray at the sides, and eyes that moved slowly and saw everything. He wore his uniform clean and pressed, but he had left all his medals and decorations in his quarters. He did not need people to know what he had done. He already knew. His job today was simple. He was an escort. He was there to make sure 2 human diplomats, a man named Owen Graves and a woman named Laura Finch, stayed safe while they talked trade agreements with species that had never liked humans very much. Ethan had done harder things in his sleep. He stood with his hands behind his back and waited. The doors at the far end of the hall opened wide, and the room shifted. Everyone felt it before they saw it, a change in the air, like the moment before a storm. Then she walked in. Princess Veilira of the Sereth Empire came through those doors like she had built the station herself and was only now choosing to visit it. She was tall, nearly 2.5 meters, with skin the color of pale blue crystal that caught the light when she moved. Her armor was ceremonial but heavy, layered in silver and deep violet, and her entourage moved around her in tight formation. 6 warriors, each of them enormous, each of them watching the room the way trained soldiers watch rooms. The Sereth were not a people who smiled at strangers. They measured worth in battle lines and bloodshed. Their history was a long list of wars they had won, and they carried that history in the way they held their shoulders and the way they looked at everyone else, like the rest of the galaxy was still catching up. Veilira's eyes moved across the hall, counting, measuring, sorting. She looked at the other delegates and gave small nods of acknowledgement. She looked at the human diplomats and said nothing at all. And then she looked at Ethan. He was leaning very slightly against the wall. His arms were still behind his back. He was watching the room the same way he had been watching it before she arrived. He did not straighten up when her gaze landed on him. He did not look away either. He just looked back at her, calm and quiet, the way a man looks at weather. Veilira said something to the warriors beside her. She said it in Sereth, a language that clicked and hummed at the back of the throat, a language that most species found almost impossible to learn. She said it quietly, but the hall had good acoustics, and she was not as far from Ethan as she thought she was. She called him a ground crawler dressed in the skin of a soldier. She said he had the posture of a servant and the eyes of a prey animal. She said that humans sent their weakest to stand guard so the weak ones would not embarrass them at the table. Her warriors laughed, low and buzzing, a sound like machinery finding its rhythm. 2 of the other delegates heard the words and understood enough to glance over at Ethan with something like sympathy or curiosity or both. Ethan heard every word. He spoke 11 languages. Sereth was the 9th one he had learned, during a 2-year posting on the border worlds where Sereth and human territory rubbed up against each other like the edges of tectonic plates. He had learned it because he needed to, and then he had kept learning it because language, he had found, was the best weapon and the best shield a person could carry. He did not react. He did not straighten. He did not tighten his jaw or look at the floor. He simply looked at Veilira for 1 more second, then let his gaze move on, back to the rest of the room, back to his job. One of the Sereth advisors, a narrow-shouldered creature named Orith who wore no armor and carried only a small tablet device, did not laugh with the others. He had been watching the human soldier since they walked in, trying to place something he could not quite name. Now he watched the human not react, and something shifted in his thinking. Orith looked down at his tablet and began to search. Across the hall, Owen Graves leaned toward Laura Finch and whispered something. She shook her head slightly. They both looked at Ethan. He was already looking somewhere else, his face easy and open, as if the most powerful woman in the Sereth Empire had just told him the weather was nice. The summit began 20 minutes later. People found their seats. Translators connected their earpieces. Documents were passed around. Ethan moved to a position near the door that gave him a clear view of every entrance and exit in the room, and he stood there, and he watched. Veilira sat at the head of the Sereth table and did not look at him again. She had already forgotten him, or thought she had. That was how it worked with people like her. You mocked the small ones and moved on. The small ones did not follow you. Orith sat slightly behind her and to the left, and he was still reading his tablet, and his expression had gone very still, and he had not looked up in several minutes. The hall filled with the careful, polite sounds of diplomacy, words chosen slowly, offers wrapped in formal language, questions that were really demands wearing softer clothes. It was the kind of work that looked easy from the outside and was exhausting from the inside, and Ethan had sat in enough of these rooms to know exactly what every pause and hesitation meant. He stood at the door and watched and waited. That was his job today. That was the whole of it. He was very good at waiting. The afternoon session of the summit broke for a midday rest period. Delegates filtered out of the main hall into the station's common spaces, wide corridors with benches and soft lighting that Calypso's designers had clearly intended to feel welcoming, though the result was something closer to a waiting room in a hospital that had given up on pretending. Ethan walked Owen and Laura to the station's small dining area, made sure they had food and a secure table, then positioned himself near the entrance. He drank water. He did not eat. He had learned long ago that the best time for something to go wrong was when you were chewing. The Sereth delegation came through the dining area on their way to wherever Sereth delegations went during breaks. Veolyra did not look at Ethan. Her warriors walked close formation, their armored boots loud on the metal floor. But Orith paused at the entrance to the corridor, just for a moment, and looked at Ethan with the kind of careful attention that Ethan recognized immediately. It was the look of a person who had just learned something they wished they had known earlier. Ethan nodded at him. Orith walked on. 2 hours later, a junior Sereth officer named Drivak, young, broad-chested, with the overconfident posture of someone who had trained hard and not yet been tested seriously, came into the common hall where the delegates were beginning to gather again. He moved through the crowd in a way that was not accidental, and he stopped directly in front of Ethan. He was a full head taller. He smelled like metal and something sharp and chemical that Ethan thought was probably some kind of Sereth performance supplement. His eyes were pale gold and full of the specific kind of excitement that young soldiers got when they thought they were about to prove something. He said, in Sereth and then in translated standard for the benefit of the room, that the humans did their summit escorts a disservice by sending beings so clearly unsuited to the role, and that perhaps a friendly demonstration of combat readiness would be educational for everyone present. He smiled when he said it. He had good teeth, Ethan noticed. Very white, very even, the kind of teeth that came from a life with good food and no real hardship. People were watching. About 30 delegates and aides had already filtered back into the hall, and now more were stopping, turning, reading the room the way people always read rooms when they sensed that something was about to become interesting or uncomfortable or both. Ethan said no. He said it politely, with a small nod, and then moved to step around the officer. Drivak stepped with him, blocking the path. He said that perhaps the human had not understood. He made the offer again, louder this time. Ethan said no again. Same tone. Same nod. He moved to step the other way. Drivak put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. It lasted 4 seconds. People who were watching reported it differently afterward. Some said they did not see exactly what happened because it was too fast. Some said they saw Ethan move the hand and turn, and then suddenly Drivak was on the floor, and some said they heard a sound like something clicking into a new position. What they all agreed on was this: Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He did not pause to look at what he had done. Drivak was on the floor, one arm twisted at a precise angle that immobilized him completely without breaking anything. He was not unconscious. He was simply unable to move without making the pain significantly worse, and he was experienced enough to understand that, so he stayed still. Ethan stepped around him. He looked at a nearby aide, a small, nervous creature from one of the border worlds, and asked calmly whether the afternoon session had a confirmed start time, because he wanted to make sure his charges were seated before things began. The aide told him. Ethan thanked him and walked on. The hall was very quiet. Veolyra had seen it from across the room. She stood with her arms at her sides, and her expression doing something complicated that her advisors had never seen on her face before. 2 of her senior warriors moved to collect Drivak from the floor. He was not badly hurt. He was embarrassed, which, for a Sereth soldier, was considerably worse than being hurt. Orith was at her side almost immediately. He held his tablet and he said, in Sereth, very quietly, that she should look at something. She took the tablet. She read. The file on Ethan Cole was not long in pages, but it was dense in the way that files about very specific people were dense, full of references and incident numbers and the kind of careful, neutral language that official documents used when they were describing things that were difficult to describe neutrally. It noted that he had served in the pacification of the Denver Corridor, 3 systems, for separate species in open conflict, resolved in 11 months without the civilian casualties that every military projection had anticipated. It noted his 61 days alone at Outpost Kale, during which he had held a communication relay station that 7 different reports had already written off as lost. It noted his role in the end of the Veshan insurgency. That last entry had a subnote. The subnote said that the method of resolution was disputed across 14 separate historical accounts and that no consensus had been reached on what exactly Ethan had said in the room with the Veshan leaders, because the 3 people present who were not Ethan had each reported it differently, and Ethan himself had filed a report that described the outcome but not the specific words. The insurgency had ended. Everyone agreed on that part. Veolyra handed the tablet back to Orith without a word. She looked across the hall to where Ethan was standing near the door again, in the same position as before, watching the room, his face easy and open and saying nothing at all. Orith said, still quietly, that this was not the file of a man who had been sent here because he was considered expendable. Veolyra did not answer him. The afternoon session began. People took their seats. The careful, slow work of diplomacy resumed. And Ethan stood at the door and watched, the way he always watched, and the room moved around him like water around a stone that had been there long enough that the water had stopped noticing it. But Veolyra noticed. She did not look at him often, but when she did, her gaze stayed a half-second longer than it had before. Orith noticed that too. He said nothing. He went back to his tablet and began reading the file a second time, more carefully now, paying attention to the parts he had skimmed the first time around. It started with a sound. Not a loud one, a deep, low vibration that passed through the floor of the station and up through the soles of every shoe and boot in the building, the kind of sound that the body felt before the ears understood it. Then the lights changed. The soft white overhead panels flickered once, twice, and shifted to an amber emergency tone that cast the whole hall in the color of old fire. 3 things happened at almost exactly the same moment. The main doors to the hall sealed with a sound like a vault closing. A voice came over the station's announcement system and told everyone to remain calm in a tone that made calm seem very far away, and Ethan Cole moved. He moved toward Owen Graves and Laura Finch first, 2 steps, already beside them before most people in the room had finished looking up from their seats. He put one hand on the table in front of them and spoke quickly and quietly. He said, "Stay at this table, stay low, do not go near the doors, do not use your comm devices yet." Then he crossed the room to the station security chief, a veteran named Carl Bates, a heavy-set man with a short gray beard and the particular tiredness of someone who had been running station security for 12 years and thought he had seen everything. Carl was already pulling up schematics on a wall panel. His jaw was tight and his hands were steady, which Ethan recognized as the look of a man who was handling things correctly but did not like what he was handling. The Hollow Creed had taken 3 of the station's 6 levels. They had moved fast and organized, which meant they had been planning this for a long time and had people already on the station before the summit began, people who had been patient and invisible and waiting. They had hostages on Level 2 and Level 4. One of the hostages on Level 4 was Owen Graves. One was Laura Finch. They had been in the dining hall for a snack between sessions. Ethan went very still when Carl told him this. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a person sorting through a large amount of information very fast and deciding what mattered first. Carl walked him through the security plan. It was a reasonable plan. Carl had clearly thought hard about it, and it would probably work, given enough time and enough luck, and assuming the Hollow Creed behaved in predictable ways. Ethan listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Carl finished, Ethan asked 2 questions. The first was about the ventilation system layout on Level 4. The second was about whether the Hollow Creed's leader had sent any communication yet, or whether they were still in the setup phase. Carl answered both. Then he paused and looked at Ethan with the look of a man who had just remembered something he should have thought about sooner. He said, "You have done something like this before, haven't you?" It was not quite a question. Ethan said yes. He said it the same way someone might confirm they had been to a city before. Not bragging, not modest, just accurate. Then he said that Carl's plan was solid, and he had a different one, and he would like Carl to hear it before deciding. Carl nodded. Ethan laid it out in about 90 seconds, sketching on the schematic panel with one finger. When he finished, Carl looked at the lines Ethan had drawn for a long moment. Then Carl stepped back from the panel and said, "You lead, I follow." In the sealed observation room off the side of the main hall, Veilira stood at the window and watched. She could not hear what was being said. She watched Ethan move through the room, not with urgency, not with visible tension, just with a kind of settled, deliberate purpose, the way a person moved when they were not afraid of what was in front of them because they had already decided what to do about it. Orith stood behind her. He said that the Hollow Creed were a radical splinter group, no home world, no flag, motivated by what they called liberation from all treaty systems. He said that they had taken hostages before, on 2 separate occasions, and that both previous incidents had ended badly for the hostages. Veilira did not move from the window. Orith said, "2 of the human delegates are among the hostages." She said, "I know." He said, "The human soldier is taking command of the security response." She did not answer that one. She just watched. On level 4 of the station, in a supply corridor that smelled like recycled air and old machinery, Owen Graves sat with his back against a metal wall and tried to keep his breathing even. He was 24 years old. He had a degree in interplanetary law, and he spoke 3 languages, and he had been so proud to be assigned to this summit. Laura Finch sat beside him. She was 40, a career diplomat, and she was watching the room with a professional calm that Owen was doing his best to borrow. There were 9 other hostages in the corridor. 2 were Seraph delegates, which Owen thought was interesting. The Hollow Creed was apparently willing to upset everyone equally. A man with a hard face and tired eyes stood at the end of the corridor holding a weapon. He had said his name was Felix Dunn, and he had said it the way people said things when they wanted you to know they were not afraid of you knowing who they were. Felix Dunn had once, apparently, been something else before he became this. Owen did not know the details. He just knew that Felix Dunn had the look of a person who had already decided that the story ended a certain way, and was just working through the middle parts. Owen's comm device buzzed once, very softly, against his leg. He did not look at it. He had been told not to use it. He trusted the person who had told him that. He kept his breathing even and he waited. The open channel crackled to life at 1400 station time. Ethan's voice came through at first, not loud, not forceful, just present, the way a voice was present when the person speaking had made peace with the silence on the other end. He said, "Felix, this is Ethan Cole. I want to talk to you. Not at you. With you. There is a difference, and I think you know that." There was a long pause. Then Felix Dunn's voice came back. It was flat and careful, the voice of a man who had rehearsed being reasonable because he knew that reasonable-sounding people lasted longer in these situations. He said he was listening. He said the humans had 40 minutes before he demonstrated that he was serious. Ethan said, "Tell me what you want to happen at the end of this. Not what you want from us right now. What does the end of this look like to you?" Another pause. Longer this time. Felix started talking. He talked about treaty systems that protected governments and not people. He talked about border worlds that had been handed back and forth between empires like playing cards while the people who lived on them watched and had no say. He talked about a family he had on one of those worlds, once. He used the past tense. He did not explain what that meant, and he did not need to. Ethan listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer sympathy in the quick, shallow way that people offered sympathy when they were really just waiting for the other person to stop talking. He just listened, and when Felix ran out of words and the channel went quiet, Ethan said, "I hear you. And I want you to hear something in return." He began to lay things out. Not threats, facts. Exit options that the Hollow Creed thought they had and why each one led somewhere that Felix, if he thought clearly about it, would not actually choose. He did it the way you laid out a map for someone who was lost, not to embarrass them, just to show them where they actually were. Carl Bates stood 2 corridors away, listening through his earpiece, and did not move. His team was in position. He had told them to wait for his word. He was starting to think that word might not be necessary. In the observation room, Veilira had stopped watching through the window and was standing very still, listening to the audio feed that Orith had connected to her earpiece. Her expression had gone somewhere private and hard to read. On level 4, Owen Graves heard footsteps change. He heard Felix Dunn, at the end of the corridor, shift his weight. Small things. But Owen had been sitting very still and paying very close attention for 3 hours, and small things had become very loud. Then Felix Dunn did the thing that Ethan had known was coming, because it was the thing that people in Felix's position always did when they felt the room closing in on them. He grabbed a hostage, and he said the thing that was supposed to end all negotiation. He said, "I will execute this one on the station feed in 5 minutes, and after that we will talk about what I want." The hostage was Owen Graves. Owen felt the grip on his collar and thought, with the specific clarity that came from being very frightened and very awake, that this was going to be the worst 5 minutes of his life or the last 5 minutes of his life, and he was not sure which. And then he thought about the voice on the channel and decided that he was going to trust it, and he went very still and did not struggle. On the channel, there was silence. 3 seconds of it. Complete and total, the kind of silence that had weight. Then Ethan spoke. 3 people transcribed what he said in those next 2 minutes. Carl Bates wrote one version. Orath wrote another. A station security aide wrote a third. All 3 versions agreed on the general shape of it. Ethan spoke about Felix specifically, not about the situation, not about the Hollow Creed, but about Felix Dunn as a person, and what Felix Dunn would have to carry with him if Owen Graves did not walk out of that corridor. He spoke about the border world family Felix had mentioned, using the past tense the same way Felix had used it, and he said something about the difference between people who caused the loss and people who remembered it. The 3 transcriptions disagreed on the exact words. They all agreed on the tone. Not emotional. Not a plea. The tone of a man describing something he had seen before, clearly and without drama, and simply asking Felix to look at it too. At 4 minutes and 40 seconds, Felix Dunn let go of Owen Graves' collar. Owen sat back down on the floor. His legs were not reliable. At 19 minutes, Felix Dunn sent a message on the open channel. He said he was willing to talk terms. He said the hostages could sit down. He said he wanted water. Carl Bates exhaled very slowly. His team held position. At 31 minutes, the doors to the Level 4 corridor opened, and the hostages walked out. Laura Finch came out first, then Owen, then the others. Security personnel met them immediately. Owen sat down on the floor of the corridor outside and put his head in his hands, not from grief but from the sudden removal of a weight he had been holding so long it had started to feel normal. At 38 minutes, Felix Dunn surrendered personally. He walked out with his hands visible and his face carrying the expression of a man who had come to the end of something long. Station security took him into custody carefully and without incident. He said nothing to anyone. But when they walked him past the corridor junction where Ethan was standing, he stopped for just a moment and looked at Ethan with an expression that the security aide standing nearby later described as something between broken and relieved. Ethan looked back at him. He said, quietly enough that only Felix could hear, "I know." Felix walked on. Security walked with him. Carl Bates sat down on a crate in the corridor and looked at the ceiling for a long time. There were no casualties. The station was intact. It was over. Ethan found the station cafeteria. He ordered coffee. He sat by himself at a table near the window that looked out onto empty space, and he put both hands around the mug, and he was quiet. Veolira looked for Ethan in all the wrong places first. She checked the command center, where Carl Bates was filing incident reports and drinking something from a metal flask that was probably not water. She checked the security hub, where technicians were running diagnostics on the systems the Hollow Creed had briefly compromised. She checked the diplomatic wing, where Owen Graves was giving a statement to a recorder while Laura Finch sat beside him with the patient stillness of someone who had been through this kind of thing before and knew what the person next to you needed in the aftermath. No one in any of these places was Ethan Cole. She found him in the cafeteria. She almost walked past the door, because the cafeteria was not where people like him were supposed to be after something like this. People like him were supposed to be in command centers and briefing rooms, accepting handshakes and having their records updated. That was how it worked on her world. That was how it worked everywhere she had ever been. But Ethan was in the cafeteria, at a table near the window, with a mug of coffee going cold in front of him and his hands wrapped around it and his eyes looking out at the dark. Veolira walked across the cafeteria. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking. It was not the kind of thing she normally did. She was royalty, and royalty waited for things to be offered. But something about the room made titles feel like they belonged somewhere else. Ethan looked at her. He did not look surprised. He just waited. There was silence. Long enough that it became its own kind of thing, a space between them where words could have been but weren't. In Seraph culture, when two people sat in silence and one of them spoke first, it meant that person was making an admission. Not of guilt, of something deeper than that. An acknowledgement. A concession that the other person was owed something real. Veolyra spoke first. She did not use the formal words of political apology, the ones that Seraph diplomats used when one government needed to say sorry to another without actually feeling it. She used the old phrase, the one that warriors used between each other after a battle that had taught them something. It had no direct translation, but it meant something close to, "I measured you by the wrong scale, and I am telling you that I know that now." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he took his coffee mug and slid it a few inches to the center of the table. It was a small gesture. In roughly 40% of human cultures, it meant something like, "We can start over if you want." She looked at the mug. She looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does it always end quietly with you?" He thought about it. He took the question seriously, which she noticed and appreciated, because most people in his position would have said something quick and easy and moved on. He sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with a question that is actually worth answering. He said, "The loud endings mean something went wrong." She looked at the window. Outside, the stars were old and indifferent and very far away, and the station was a small warm thing in the middle of all that cold distance, and inside it, people who had been trying to kill each other's ideas 3 hours ago were now filing incident reports and drinking bad coffee and sitting in plastic chairs. She said that on her world, warriors who had done what he had done would be given monuments and titles and songs. She said the Seraph Empire had 47 specific honorifics for people who resolved conflicts of this scale, and that most of them involved the word eternal in some form. She asked how humans honored someone like him. He was quiet for a moment. He did not look like he was performing modesty. He looked like he was genuinely trying to remember. He said, "Mostly we just send them somewhere else that needs fixing." She laughed. It came out real and sudden, not the carefully managed expression she wore at summits and ceremonies, but something that had slipped out before she could decide whether to let it. She covered it quickly, but it had already happened, and Ethan had already seen it, and he did not make anything of it, which made her like him a little more than she wanted to. They sat in the cafeteria for another 20 minutes. They did not talk about politics or treaties or the incident reports that were already being filed in 17 different offices across the station. They talked about other things, small things, the kind of conversation that two people have when they are both tired and honest and not trying to get anything from each other. She asked him where he had learned Seraph. He told her about the border world posting, about learning the language from a retired Seraph soldier who ran a repair shop and had strong opinions about proper grammar. She asked if the soldier had been hard to understand. He said the grammar had been fine. It was the idioms that had taken the longest, because Seraph idioms assumed a specific set of experiences that he had not had. She said that was true of most languages. He agreed. When she stood to leave, she paused for a moment. She said, in Seraph, that she owed him a different kind of attention than the one she had given him when she walked into the hall that morning. He said, in Seraph, that it was forgotten. She looked at him. She said, "I do not think it should be forgotten. I think I would like to remember it." He did not answer that. He just picked up his coffee mug. She turned and walked out. The next morning, the summit resumed. The main hall was cleaned, the doors unsealed, the lighting returned to white. Delegates filtered in slowly, with the careful, measured movements of people who had been through something and were still deciding how much it had changed them. When Veolyra entered, she crossed the hall before going to her own table. She walked directly to the corner near the door where Ethan was standing, and she inclined her head, not the shallow nod she had given other delegates, not the political gesture, but the full Seraph movement, the one that was reserved for recognized equals. The one that said, "I see you as you are, not as I assumed you to be." The room noticed. A few delegates exchanged glances. Orith closed his tablet and folded his hands and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a person who had suspected something was coming and was not entirely surprised that it had arrived. Ethan returned the nod. Simple and clear. Then Veolyra went to her table, and Ethan went back to watching the room, and the summit began. Some things did not need monuments. Some of them just needed two people in a cafeteria, in the quiet after everything was over, willing to set their scales aside and start again.